Thank you for the introduction. I realise we're getting to the end of the second very long day, so I've got quite a few slides here that I'm going to tear through. I'll try not to repeat too much what we've just talked about on the panel. I feel like it's a bit kind of unfair that I get the last say. But look, let's start with open source. We kind of know what open is, but source is... People think that just because we can download a model makes it open source, but source is a distinct and distant concept, right? It's like the source of a river or the source of food or salmon or whatever. Like this water bottle has a source. The source is not itself. So unless somebody gives you, typically we talk about the source going through some compilation process, having an object form, unless they've got the object in one hand, like the model, and the source, like the data in the other, then it can't really be open source. Now, we've been outrageously successful. We've got a $30 billion industry. You'll hear these numbers quite frequently, growing to $80 billion. It's underpinning $8.8 trillion of economic activity. It's in 97% of software, open source licensed libraries, and 9 in 10 enterprises are based on it. So we want to replicate that success, and I don't want to repeat too much from the panel, but what we definitely don't want to do is kind of do harm to open source. So kind of first, do no harm. Right now, the way that open source actually works and what made it so valuable is that we have 4 essential freedoms. The actual freedoms from the Free Software Foundation are worded a little bit differently and there's a bit of overlap, but I use these ones because it's very clear and accessible and easy for people to understand, right? So to use, study, modify, and share software. There's a layer of indirection here in that we go to the open source definition, which is 10 principles that kind of make that a little bit more concrete. And the one where we've run into trouble is source code. We heard this morning that going forward, what changes the behaviour of the software is going to be the data. And we also heard from Simon Wardley, who was here earlier, that the data forms part of the symbolic instructions and really should be included in those components that you require for reproducibility. Right, so these 10 points, and Amanda talks about how nobody knows what the 10 points are, including the authors, but this is the open source definition v1.9. So the title, Open Source 2.0, is both kind of a call to arms to have a discussion about what we as a community want from Open Source 2.0, but also the reality that if we were to release a new version of the open source definition, it would be 2.0 because it's the next one after 1.9. So kind of my proposal is that we start thinking about like whether we want to make that change and what that change might be. And then where it really gets to be concrete is in the licenses. There's 96 licenses, probably 90 licenses too many. There's been a proliferation project that's been done to try and reduce those number of licenses. We have project-specific licenses, and then we have new licenses starting to come through around crypto and this kind of stuff that have been quite contentious. And you'll see I say open source definition compliant licenses rather than necessarily OSI approved licenses, and this is from something we set up at opensourcedefinition.org, which is kind of like a life raft because of the machinations that are going on around open source AI. Quick little history of how we got to where we are today. We had a long-haired bearded Unix geek who got upset about a jamming printer that was donated by Xerox. Xerox wouldn't give him the code, so he set about trying to make a notification system when it would jam without the source code. 10 years later, some fellow middle-aged white guys came out and said, we need this to be more business-friendly. It's all well and good. We get, free as in freedom, not as in beer. That's great, but we need it to be more friendly. So they drafted the Debian social contract, including the Debian free software guidelines, which became verbatim the open source definition 1.0. Right? So these same guys, the Ian in Debian, Eric Raymond, Bruce Perrins, and so on, both wrote the open source definition and created the open source initiative. Worth noting that it was actually Christine Peterson, I think, who came up with the term open source in the context of Netscape Navigator. So that went along. We had 10 revisions over the first 10 years. Cloud computing came along. The open source initiative were not kind of really present about that, not even not present, but kind of were actively not helping us, I guess. So we created the Open Cloud initiative and worked out that Open Cloud means a combination of open standard interfaces and formats. And I have the receipts there in the form of some angry emails from lawyers about trademarks and things. And then in 2017, we had, of course, the paper from Google and ultimately ChatGPT, fancy autocomplete. And that got us to the point where we are with the open source AI definition, which is quite contentious. But in reality, it was actually 1999, the year after the OSI was launched, that the ship hit the iceberg in the release of by ID Software of Quake. So they released the game engine, but without the data, without the packs, without the monsters, without the maps. This did result in a whole lot of forking, and you can see the tree there of all of the different derivatives of the Quake engine, but it was not Quake. And the important thing is, if you're going to say this thing is open source, you actually need to give all of the source components, including this case data, but in the case of AI, the model, the trained models as well. Cloud computing, happily the FSF came to save the day. Again, when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, so they released the Afro GPL, which says, because all of a sudden licenses weren't being conveyed, they were being offered as a service, and so they didn't trigger the viral clauses of the GPL, for example, so they say they extended that to any operation over the network, which created what's called the service provider loophole, and that kind of patched that partially. And then, of course, yeah, we get to this fancy Clippy, ChatGPT, and this is where the wheels kind of really fell off. Happily, the FSF again is coming, and I'm more of a businessman here than a free software zealot, to be clear. I have a venture studio, but I am quite interested in the work that they're doing, and particularly they're being a lot more nuanced and slower, maybe too slow, while the other guys are being too fast, but they do recognise that there are non-software components that are dependencies for reproducibility of an AI system, right? And we talk about trying to say that a system is like, I don't say this laptop is open source, right? It's running Mac OS, which is clearly not open source, but underneath that is some open source, and on top of that, I've got like open source software like Homebrew. So you don't typically look at open source at a system level, and that's why our friends at RedMonk, Stephen O'Grady, came out and said, after saying there were some AI conundrums we had to solve, he actually came out and said, you know what, I've thought about it some more, and this can't be solved for machine learning. Right? So we talk about AI, but actually really it's kind of specifically machine learning. And he used the example of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge and said, look, the open source AI definition is already starting to show signs of fracturing, and we know what happened with the Tacoma Narrows Bridge is it started undulating and then ultimately collapsed. And so I'm not too anxious about this thing being a success, because I think that the technology doesn't care about what the OSI board thinks or what Meta's marketers think. It doesn't care about it. Either it works as a functional litmus test that can be applied by users without having to ask for permission, or it doesn't. So I'm pretty sure that we're okay in that sense. But they might make enough, throw up enough dust to make enough of a mess that we've got a serious problem. So what is the problem? And I know I'm rushing and I'm speaking quickly, so hopefully, if you're not following, then by all means use VLC and the AI subtitling and slow it down, and you could review it later. But the problem is that while the open source definition is very good and proven over a quarter century on openness, it fails on completeness, at least when it comes to data, or at least it's implicit on completeness. Now, one attempt to fix that has been the Linux Foundation's MOF, the Model Openness Framework, and Mozilla have had a crack at this as well. And that's good in completeness. It gives you a list of things that you would have to include to be complete. But then it fails on openness because it says you can make the data available. It asks for the data in class 1, but it says you can make the data available under any license or unlicensed, right? We'll come back to that in a minute. And the open source AI definition recognizes the importance of data and even goes to the effort of defining 4 classes of data. What is open, public, obtainable, and private, but then accepts any or all of them or none of them. Right? So it is a complete failure in both openness and completeness, because remember we said the data is the symbolic instructions. Right? So this is the MOF, and in class 1, not only are they saying the data can be provided under any license or unlicensed like Common Crawl, which is basically a dump of the internet, they're also for the first time ever asking for documentation. And we've never asked for documentation in open source, right? You might have a quantum library that's understandable by 2 people, doesn't have a single comment in it, and it's still valid, valuable open source code. Okay, so I'm really worried when I start seeing us kind of, again, expanding the scope of open source to cover things that we've never, ever covered before. This suggests that there might be a class 0, right? So open science is about reproducibility, not about reuse and sharing. So there could even be a class 0 here. And if the LF were to say, maybe let's not worry so much about documentation because they'll work it out, but rather worry about licensing, right, open licensing, then we could say, yeah, there's an open source class 0 that actually solves that problem.
Question.
Yeah.
Is this the right direction, do you think, that LF is
Look, I think that you need to cover, like, the problem is we don't know what needs to be included, right? So you've got training data, but it's not just training data. It's like anything you do with pre-preparation, it's evals, it's, there's a whole lot of stuff that you would include for reproducibility. And even when you've got it all, we get the 4D chess players who are saying, well, it's not reproducible, I can't get the same hash, But it doesn't matter, as long as it behaves the same. But then if you talk to people like at Meta, for example, about, how could I reproduce Llama 3, even they don't know, because it's like being a chef and putting in a pinch of salt, right? You don't necessarily know. Now, at least one of the things with DeepSeek is that we do have this like giant bash script as a gist where you can reproduce it, and Hugging Face, of course, are working on reproducing it as OpenR1. So yes, but not specifically this list. What it comes down to, though, is open data, which again forms part of the source, and that then is kind of compiled or trained, composted, if you like, into open weights, and then it's animated by the code. And it's a tiny little bit of code, right? I mean, you might have many gigabytes of data, and then just a couple of lines of code that uses open source libraries. And so the value is not in the code anymore, right? The behavior of the system. And if the next generation, we talk about building the next generation on top of the last, if the next generation was to build like a word processor, they would take a block of text, they would show it 10,000 documents, and they'd say, turn that text into those documents. And then if you want to change a behavior, like if I want to, for example, remove Comic Sans, I have to go through those 10,000 documents and remove any signs of Comic Sans, because we know that if the training process sees it, it can memorize it and recall it, right? And if I don't have the data, right, maybe I can kind of fine tune around the edges, but you're now, as a vendor, you're telling me what an improvement is. And that's not open source. You need to, it's not just to say you can study kind of, you look at the input and see outputs and so that's study. No, I want to study it down to the record level, and so we need to fully protect the 4 freedoms. And this is where we have a problem with what the OSI is presenting, and they just presented this last week and at FOSDEM, and they say, okay, the 4 freedoms, okay, we agree there. They say it's the weights and the codes and the data, but the fine print, what is it, large print giveth, the fine print taketh away, when legally possible. Now, if you're looking at like procurement standards and you see that when legally possible, you're a vendor, you're like, well, I'm just going to cross out that whole column. It doesn't exist. And all I need to provide is the weights and the code to animate the weights. So the open source AI definition is an open weight definition. It's not a very good open weight definition because it asks for other nonsense you don't need, but it is an open weight definition. Now, you don't have to hear that from me. You can talk to Bruce Perens, who was the original author of the open source definition. Yep.
What does that clarify for you?
What does it clarify?
It's an open weights definition.
So look, a proprietary model like Llama is incredibly useful and a great gift that costs them a lot of money. That's great. And there's a lot of applications and people use proprietary software all day. Sometimes they pay for it. That's great. Open weight models are even better because I can use it, I can share it with my friends, they can't take it off me, they can't start billing me for it, right? So there are inherent advantages. We basically protect the freedoms to use and share a model, but not to study and modify it. So it's kind of like I don't want to say open source light because I don't want the definition, it's already a definition, it's already a phrase that's being used that was undefined, and so we set out to define it, and really it's, and I'll come, well, we'll probably skip that slide, but it's for people who want, vendors who want to use the term open source but don't want to give up the pound of flesh, right? They don't want to give up the source, the data, they can use open weight. But users have to understand they're not going to enjoy the benefits to study and modify the model, only to use it and share it. So Bruce says it's not open source, and he's upset that this thing that he created is being involved in open washing. When it was released, we didn't have like AI2's Olmo, Molmo2, Playas, and all of these open source. I don't want to say truly open source because that's kind of conceding that, giving up ground. But there are now LLMs. We saw Lucy this morning, which is well on track to being an open source LLM, except for the voice. And so, we now have that additional information. So it's proof that they've moved too quickly with this. And he says, you don't need to change anything, just apply the open source definition as it is. Maybe you've got to apply it to the code and the data separately, but it works. Now, if you look at my colleagues, and remember Bruce and ESR and Ian and so on, and myself, all Debian developers, right? And if we ask the Debian developers what they think, and there's been a discussion on Debian Project, they're saying that to require users to build a substantially equivalent system, right? To find a skilled person who can rebuild it, and not give them the source is, and the guys in France said you got to be French here, and so I'd say n'importe quoi, right? But apparently the technical term is obvious bullshit. And I kind of agree, right? But the plural of anecdote is not data, right? So you've got two views of Debian developers now, and plus Bruce. There is a general resolution on the way. This is one of the first drafts. You'll see that they refer to these models as toxic candy, right? So you can use it, but you don't have the freedoms. And it looks like it's going to go in the direction of, there'll be a vote and so on, but I think it's going to go in the direction of requiring the training data. We spoke about the problem with VLC before and how we've now got two definitions from the same organisation, one of which says that it is open source and the other which says that it's not. That's obviously not acceptable, so we really do need to have one definition. But if we leave them to their own devices, then the risk is that they'll harmonise the open source AI definition with the open source definition. And with AI being the new hotness, it's likely that that one will be the one that takes precedence. So there's a real risk here. When I said before, first do no harm, we really need to make sure that we don't break open source. We've had a whole bunch of excuses about why they can't possibly release the data. There's PII, sometimes specific PII, like medical records. I mean, consent typically does work around things like GDPR. If I take a cancer scan, a lung scan, breast cancer scan, something like that, I can donate that, right? The NHS might do an opt-out system, so they can collect those 10,000 images or whatever it is that they need to create a useful ML model for breast cancer detection. So this is kind of a bit of an excuse. Federated learning is designed specifically to hide to hide data so that the participants can't see each other's data. So that's clearly not open source. Text and data mining exception allows you to use data on the internet for certain study for science, but it doesn't give you the ability to then reproduce content. So if you train it and then the model goes out and starts printing Mickey Mouse, right, you've basically just released a zip file of Hollywood content and somebody's going to get sued. It might not be you as the vendor, but somebody's going to get sued. We've covered hardware costs. We've heard about security by obscurity. You do need the data to deal with security issues. We've even heard about ethics. So the co-designers of this thing actually need the data to deal with ethics to assess and address fairness and bias issues. So that's quite interesting that that's their outcome. We've heard about the EUI Act, and then of course even child sexual abuse material. So the kind of, when somebody think of the children, clearly we don't want our models to be trained on that stuff, right? It's the worst possible content you can imagine on the internet, just like we don't want conflicts diamonds in our supply chains and so on. And of course, Meta. But Meta have proven that they're going to do what Meta are going to do. There's a paper about memorization and reproduction, recall with basically photographic precision. There's a proof of concept of that where a model has been trained on GPL code of Linux kernel and it just sits there and spews out GPL code, right? The French, they say le chien ne font pas le chat, or des chats, which means dogs don't make cats. Right? So you've got GPL on the way in. It's not by calling the model MIT that it's going to be GPL, that it's going to be MIT on the way out. That's another topic for lawyers, and we could have a whole session on that. The AI Act, the subject of it is actually the license, not the AI, right? So it's a carve out, and to Ben Brooks's point, they're solving different problems. And if they happen to land at the same place, it's by accident, it's not by design. We have released the open weight definition. It's basically based on the open source definition, but it surgically removes those teeth relating to those two, to studying and modifying a model. And then we're looking now at what this 2.0 could look like. And I've got a quote here from the panel around the Chinese panel around DeepSeek, and it was like, it'll be an open source world. We won't have to be paranoid of each other. So this is part of the reason why we want to do it. And I guess what's that? Well,
Really, truly.
yeah. Well, hopefully that's what we're working towards. And then what this actually looks like is like, what bug fixes can we make to the open source definition for a 2.0? Right, again, it's like a constitutional amendment, so we'd need a very high standard, but they're called constitutional amendments because they're amendments, right? So it's possible, but we have to get a very high level of consensus, and currently we don't have the steward on board. So this is like, do we mention the 4 freedoms? Do we explicitly say it's got to be reproducible? Do we move from like programmers to practitioners? Do we move from the preferred form to the actual form? And critically, do we say that if the dependencies are data, they form part of the source? And so the way that we're doing that is by launching the Open Source Alliance next week at the AI Summit, the AI Action Summit in Paris. It's one of the official AI convergence challenges under the topic of global AI governance, where it's setting it up to be more of a servant leader approach, like Agile, rather than in kind of an umbrella like the Linux Foundation. And the idea is really just to go around and say, look, we don't need to have one voice representing the sponsors of one country. We want everybody to have a voice and to stand up and use it and say what they want, right? But I'm not going to try and, not going to be able to put words in their mouth. But we need to move, I think, more to a UN type or an ICANN type model, because this stuff really does affect all of us. And kind of we've got one country in particular who's come out and said, we are absolutely going to dominate this area. And that's not good for the UK, it's not good for France, it's not good for Canada. So I'm from Australia, but I live between France and Canada. And it's not even good for America, right? Because, America is built on open source. It's built a massive industry of technology on open source. And they would be well served by being able to carry forward that benefit into the world of AI. And I've 1 minute over. So hopefully, I don't know if we've got any time for any questions, but...
Just one quick clarification. So if you'd have been responsible for the OSI, you wouldn't have created a definition?
No, I don't think it was necessary or wanted. And Amanda did a survey at one of these events, and less than 50% of people said they wanted it.
What do you do about the pressure from Meta and what happened with the way that
Ignore it.
Ignore it.
They're ignoring us. They've ignored the OSI. So.
Yeah. And just to be absolutely clear, you talked about code, weights, and data.
Yep.
You talked about Bruce Perrin saying you can apply open source to the code. You've got open data definition of a license for the data. You need a definition for the weights. Is that what you were saying on that slide when you talked about the open weights?
The problem, we can't just use open source definitions because they have a concept, like GPL, for example, has a concept of source and object form. And so it's just fundamentally not compatible with applying to weights only, whereas something like MIT, which doesn't have that concept, Apache does, but for different reasons, and I think that it's okay. But MIT is clearly one that works with open weights.
Thank you. We're eating into anyone's time if you would like to ask a question. Your own time, sorry.
Thank you. So at what point should we actually say that the owner of data, like people will collect data from to train our model, are no longer their data? Because sometimes we see where big tech companies will take data from people, use it the way they like, and when they are transferring it or sharing it to other people or their partners, they don't even inform the people that they use their data. So is it that the data is now or belongs to the big tech companies?
I'm not sure I followed the exact question, but the problem is today we typically start with Common Crawl, which is a dump of the internet. We compost that, and most data on the internet, most posts on the internet are all rights reserved. And so we don't have the right then to. You may have exceptions like the data mining exception, but that doesn't give you the right to reproduce it. So the question though was not exactly that, was it?
Okay, yeah. The question is similar to what you just said here. Like, at what point should we say the owner of data is no longer their data anymore? Like, we no longer need consent from them to share the data.
Yeah. So typically with licensing, the owner grants you rights. By default, it's all rights reserved and applies to anything you create. And copyright, gets interesting as well. We could have a whole day on this, but cannot necessarily be applied to machine-generated content. But to the extent it's human-generated, it's automatic and it's all rights reserved. So we give licenses to people to have limited rights, maybe with requirements like attribution. And in the case of like share-alike, like Creative Commons share-alike and GPL, we use copyright against itself, right? It's called copyleft, because we then require that you keep sharing it. But that's really in the hands of the owner. And we're the good guys, right? We're meant to be the ones respecting copyrights and empowering people to use them.
Okay. Alex, thank you. Sam, thank you. It's been a great day.